If you've ever felt lost or confused when working with React.js, just want to have a better understanding of the fundamentals, then this is the video you have been looking for. Welcome my friends to today's conceptual overview, a beginner guide to everything you should know about React.js, all the core concepts, all the core techniques that you need to become a React.js pro. There's absolutely heaps to cover in this video. We're going to completely rip through it, starting off by understanding what actually is React, then why do we use it, how does it work, some of the core concepts within React.js, and then finally we'll touch on some resources you can use to dive in, get your hands dirty, and get some practical experience. As always, if you enjoyed the video, smash the like and subscribe buttons so that I can continue to feed Doug a healthy diet. So starting off at the very beginning, let's first take a second to understand what React.js actually is. And to explain it, I'm going to tell you a story of the internet. Originally, when we first started building websites, we did that using vanilla web development. Now, vanilla web development consists of JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, and that is it. That's what websites were originally built in, where HTML and CSS are the formatting, content, and structure of the page, and the JavaScript adds the interactivity. So as we can see here, primarily HTML and CSS, and JavaScript can allow a user to interact with a page and update the screen, make it look different. Now, the biggest issue with this process is that as soon as your projects get large, it becomes very cumbersome. You have so many lines of code and individual code files, and the projects ultimately become very bloated. Now, to solve this, we created what is referred to as JavaScript frameworks, and they're absolutely brilliant, and React.js is one of them. You can tell by the .javascript extension that it is indeed a React framework, and this one is created and maintained by Facebook. Now, the primary difference between vanilla web development with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, where originally we added JavaScript to the HTML and CSS to add interactivity to a page, JavaScript frameworks instead use JavaScript at the core to create HTML and CSS that is also interactive. So it's primarily written in JavaScript, and it makes it much easier to create interactive and dynamic websites where a user is clicking a lot of buttons. There's loads of interactivity, lots of different values are changing and updating. So if that's the website you're building, you'll be looking to use a JavaScript framework, perhaps React.js. Now, a little side note about JavaScript frameworks is that JavaScript has to be run. So before, when we were using vanilla web development with HTML and CSS, basically what happens is we have an HTML and CSS web page ready to go. We send it to the browser loads it, and that is the process done. The website is displayed. When we have React or other JavaScript frameworks, we now send over the React code, and that gets converted into HTML and CSS. The browser runs a whole lot of JavaScript to produce the HTML and CSS, which then gets displayed on the page. So there's an extra step in there. We have to run some React JavaScript to produce the page to load on the screen. Now, the browser reads the HTML and CSS, but one interesting thing is that the JavaScript can actually be run client-side, which is in the browser in your Google Chrome on the user's computer, or in some cases also server-side, which means that a server can execute some JavaScript, produce the HTML page, and then send it over to the computer to load, as opposed to what was originally done in vanilla web development, where we send the HTML and CSS flat ready to go. So there's an extra step in there. It's just good to be aware of and where that code runs, either client-side or server-side. Now, to carry on, why do we use React.js? There are two primary reasons that you might want to use React.js that I love using React.js. The first one is compartmentalization. Being able to break down a project into manageable chunks. The project directory in React.js makes it so incredibly easy to maintain an absolutely Goliath project and even work together with loads of different team members on a large project. We'll talk more about how the compartmentalization in React works later, but if we compare it to vanilla web development, where we just had one or two or very few HTML files, there was just loads of code in them. Loads of CSS code, loads of JavaScript code, and it just made it very clunky, funky, jank, and not very fun to work with. Now, the second reason React.js is absolutely great, and this is a point that I've already talked about a little bit, is that it's so easy to program user interactivity. If you have a static site where static refers to the site, the HTML not really changing, then perhaps vanilla web development is actually a better solution for you. However, if the site is going to be very dynamic, lots of changes, totally dependent user to user as to how they interact with the page, then programming that with vanilla HTML and JavaScript can be a really arduous process and not a lot of fun. We'll shortly see how React makes this so much infinitely easier to do, and you can increase your development speeds 100-fold using a JavaScript framework to develop a dynamic and interactive website. Now, if we jump into how does it work, there's 5 core parts to React that you need to understand to not get lost when you're building React projects. And number 1 on the list is components, where components allow us to gain access to that compartmentalization benefit that I talked about earlier. Now, the big picture of components is that they are all about compartmentalizing our code. So when we have a section or a body of code that doesn't need a lot of external information, or perhaps is a lot of repeated code, we can throw it into its very own component. And suddenly, when we need to access, modify, update that code, we know where it sits. There's not a lot of extra bloat all around it, so it's very clean and tidy, and it allows us to compartmentalize our projects, our websites, our applications into tiny bite-sized chunks where each one, some of them communicate with one another, some of them just contain their own body of logic. That's pretty much the big picture of how they work. There's 2 main types of components. One is the parent and one is the child. And this depends on the context in which you're talking about a component. If we think about our entire application as one component, and it contains a header, a main section, and a footer, the application is the parent component, and the header, main, and footer are children to that parent application component. They might be their own subcomponents, and they themselves can have further nested components within them. Now, the actual structure of a component in React.JS, it's called a functional component. Essentially how it works is we literally write a JavaScript function. Remember, it's JavaScript first, HTML and CSS are the output of the JavaScript. We have an exported function. Now, what this allows us to do is communicate components, functional components between one another, and use them all over the place in our project directory. Now, the second core thing that happens in a component is that we return what's known as JSX, and this is going to be the next topic that we will talk about. But the main takeaway here is that components allow us to compartmentalize logic within our projects. There's 2 types, the parent and the children. The parent is the bigger component, and the children components are any contained within it. And the basis of a functional component, the basic structure, is that we have an exported function that returns JSX. It's all about compartmentalization, and that's all down to how you create your component structure or hierarchy. Now, in the actual folder directory, creating a component, a React functional component, we use the .jsx extension, file extension. Now, this is just an example. Dashboard.jsx is an example component where it's got all the logic relating to a dashboard that we're hypothetically displaying on a screen. The dashboard could in fact have subcomponents as well, and it itself will be child to a bigger parent component. It might even be the app as the whole. As I said before, it contains a function that makes it a functional component. It returns the JSX, which we'll touch on in a minute, and where this is how we define a function. If we then want to display the function, we use it as if it were an HTML tag, where the name just matches the name of the function that we're exporting, and we write it out as if it were just regular plain old HTML somewhere else, and that will then be rendered on the screen. Now, obviously in this case, this is the opening tag for the functional component, and this is the closing tag. However, there is a secondary syntax where you can have self-closing React components, and you don't need to have that closing tag. Now, to dive into JSX, basically we can just think of this as HTML that allows us to write JavaScript directly into it. Now, if we quickly take a second to think about the old way we used to write out HTML, we have a whole lot of HTML, and if we wanted to modify values in it, we would have to write a whole lot of JavaScript. We would have to access that HTML element. We would have to modify it programmatically in our JavaScript, and then we would have to use JavaScript to update the document object model, the DOM, and then that would be displayed on the screen. However, in React, it allows us to return JSX from our functional components, and we can just write out the HTML. The JSX is the HTML, except if we ever want to have any JavaScript, we can write the JavaScript directly inside of the HTML or the JSX instead of having to do all this funky, janky modification stuff with a separate JavaScript file. Here is an example. We can write out a div, and whenever we have any JavaScript, we use the curly parentheses, and within the curly parentheses, we can write some JavaScript. So here, if you wrote this in regular HTML, this would actually display on the screen. Whereas if we do it the React way, we would get this evaluated. So the screen would actually show 8. It would look like this instead. We would just have the 8 display. The divs obviously wouldn't show up. But the point is that we can write JavaScript directly inside of the HTML using the curly brackets. So that makes it incredibly easy to write dynamic code, and this happens inside of every component. The core part of a component is that it's an exported function that returns some JSX. So if we're returning a dashboard, we have a whole lot of HTML that might have a whole lot of dynamic JavaScript variables plugged into it that are updating automatically. Now, the third concept you absolutely have to know about React, and this one is critical, is state. Now, to understand state, we're first going to think about variables inside of JavaScript. Now, if you're not so hot flash in JavaScript, I've got a course linked in the description down below. You can absolutely dive in and get started on that. Big refresher course, lots of fun, highly recommended. But the point is, in JavaScript, we use variables to essentially just remember stuff. We assign something to that variable and then we can access it later. Now, the problem with variables inside of React is that if we have a standard variable, we could say let age equal to 27. If we go ahead and update that variable, the JavaScript will indeed update. However, React isn't listening for that change. And for React to work, we need to have JavaScript, and we also need to paint it to the screen to make it look pretty. And so if we're only updating and modifying that first part, if we're only updating the JavaScript and not updating the screen, the display, then we're going to update the JavaScript. However, the screen is going to look the same as it always did, which kind of defeats the point. The user can't see the interactivity, they can't see the updates. So to solve this, what we do is we use what's known as state in React. Now, just before I dive into state, you can absolutely use variables inside of React. Plain old variable, let age equal to 27. However, variables are only to be used when you have information or values that aren't going to change when the user interacts with the interface. That part is critical. Whenever the user is interacting with something and you need to gain access to or monitor that interaction, then we cannot use the plain old JavaScript variable. In such cases, we have to use what's known as useState. Now, useState is very equivalent to a variable, except React is listening to changes in the values associated with the stateful variables. So when we modify the value associated with name, React knows that that has changed and that the screen has to change to reflect the new value. The way that we create a stateful variable inside of React, we declare a variable, we initialize it as we normally would, except instead of just writing the variable name, here, this is the name of the variable. We have a variable called name. We wrap that inside of square brackets. And then the second thing here is what's known as a setter function. So if I had let age equal to 27, when I get a year older, I would just say, okay, age is now equal to 28. You can't do that when you're using a stateful variable in React. Instead, we get access to a special function that we just call as a function, and we pass in the new value we want to assign to the variable. So I would just say set name equal to James, and then the variable name will have the value James assigned to it. Now, I know that can be complicated to initially wrap your head around, but just to summarize, instead of just having const name is equal to James, we now have the variable inside of some square brackets, and then we also have a function that we use to update the variable values in future. We can initialize it as a stateful variable by calling useState, and we can also pass in a default value. We don't have to. If you do want to have a default value assigned to that variable, that stateful variable, then it just goes in here. Now, one important thing to note that a lot of people forget is that when you're using state inside of React, you have to import useState. UseState is what's known as a hook, and we will cover that in a second. And stateful variables are used for whenever you have information on the page, you need to track values that are changing with the user input. Otherwise, we can just use a plain old variable. Now, number 4 on the list is a concept known as props. Also incredibly critical, very prevalent inside of React, and it's the primary means of communicating information between components. Components would be useless if we couldn't give them access to values, variables, and information from inside of a different component. We need a way for them to communicate, and that is props. We can also think of them as properties. When we have a component, we can give it properties, which essentially allows us to communicate that information between components. As I said, you can think of it as a property of the component or the tag when we render it out. And there are two main types of props when it comes to functional components inside of React. Number 1 is the attribute style of prop, and this is very familiar to people when we assign attributes to plain old HTML tags. Here we have the plain old HTML-esque tag, and we now have an attribute to it, and we assign the string home as the value to that attribute or that prop, where the name of the prop is title. I've just wrapped it inside of curly brackets because that just allows us to write some JavaScript and then assign the value of the JavaScript to the prop with the name title. So they're basically just attributes. You can think of this as a property of this tag. The dashboard tag in this case has a title that is equal to the string home. Now, the other type of prop that we can have with functional components is called children. Now, the children, you can think of the child component. The children is anything that is child to the component. Just gonna have to drag this up, so excuse all of the terrible overlays just here. Basically, if we look at this child example, we have the dashboard opening tag, we have the dashboard closing tag, this one isn't self-closing, and we have a paragraph tag that says hello world within the opening and closing tags. This information is known as the children contents, and it's another property of the dashboard tag or the functional component in this case. Now, if we carry on, the functional component receives the properties. So when we write out or we render out the component, we give it a whole lot of properties. As we've just seen before, we can give it a title when we render it out, or we can give it children props. The functional component receives these properties. So here is an example of a functional component receiving some properties. We export our function. The function is called dashboard, and it receives an argument known as props. Now, this is just all very simple JavaScript. Now, the first line just here, I'm using the destructuring JavaScript syntax to access the title and the children from the props. We know from this example that the dashboard does in fact have a title, and it also has some children, so I can expect to destructure out both of those properties of the tag. Then what we do is we return some JSX. Here we can see it's just HTML, and we spot the squiggly or curly parentheses, which allow us to write the JavaScript straight into the HTML, making it the JSX. So right here, I have the JavaScript title, and I can just render out that value on the screen. If you recall, the value is home, so that's what will show up in place of this JavaScript right here. We'll see home on the screen. And likewise with the children, well, the children contents was this paragraph tag. It's held in JavaScript under the child alias, and then we can render it out, and so the paragraph with hello world will then be displayed on the screen. The other cool thing to note just here is we can see how tidy the functional components look. This code is super powerful, but it's just, 6 or 7 lines, and it looks super clean. Now, the last one on the list, the important concept you need to know about, is React hooks. We actually just looked at one. The useState hook that we had back here is known as a React hook. Essentially what hooks do in React, there's a few of them, is that they manage stateful logic. So anything to do with state, which is to do with the user interactivity on the page, They manage all of that stateful logic and all of these side effects inside of the functional components. Now there's a few primary hooks. The first one is the use state. That's for initializing a stateful variable inside of React. The second one is use effect. Notice that all of them start with use, and use effect is for tracking events inside of React. We could have the onMount event when the page renders. We could also track events such as when the value of a variable changes, and for that kind of stuff we use the use effect hook. Another one is use ref. This allows us to have references to different divs or retain information as a reference for later, but it's also good to note that you can write your own custom hooks. For example, if you wanted to fetch some data, you could write a hook that cleanly and tidily and effectively fetches that data, it compartmentalizes that code, and you could include loading states and error handling and all that kind of stuff. So they're just another important thing to know about when you're working with React. Now with that all said and done, a lot of the theory covered, the next thing we need to talk about is where to learn React.js. If you want to get your hands dirty and get some practical experience, build out some projects, check out the link to the React course that I just published in the description down below. It's a massive course, it's 5 hours, it covers everything. You'll build 4 amazing projects, all of them will get you a job, and the first few projects are very simple, and then they gradually get more complex, more intricate, and more impressive as well. So if you're interested in learning React, be sure to check that out. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, smash the like and subscribe buttons. Love that support, and I'll catch you guys later. Peace. Learning to code? If so, be sure to check out the Learn to Code roadmap or dive straight in with these videos. That's a good one.